Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is the Reconsider Simon podcast, and this is podcast number 25. As usual, it has been a while. Hopefully going to be doing a few more of these. There's been lots and lots of things going on. But in this particular podcast, this is going to be about Gibraltar and the old gods, and again, the old masculine and feminine energies, and more particularly to do with threshold, portals, and how some of these strange places like Gibraltar can be these powerful convergence points. And I think this is kind of a burgeoning sort of area, I don't know what you call it, research, unfoldment, just understanding narrative, where I'm sort of, reading the landscape more and more, and how finding narrative in that, and how it kind of weaves of history, but also how it affects the people that live there, and the culture and spirituality, the whole thing really, the whole of, reality and the human experience. It's just fascinating. And if we think about everything as really energy, and the physical world really is just a manifestation of that energetic kind of skeleton or underlying kind of structure, and more particularly shadow systems, and how these shadow systems, it is a representative of shadow energy, but it actually has a physical location on the map. So even if it's like a virtual thing, in terms of like finance or internet companies, these still have offices, these have servers, they all have a physical location within the landscape itself. One of the oldest shadow systems, obviously finance and money is a big one, but also the military, warring element to do with society and the energetic kind of connections to that. And particularly, I've been speaking a lot about the southwest Spain, and there's just so many military facilities all the way along the coast. And the same with Gibraltar. I mean, this is a very strategic place for the British, so there's a huge military presence there as well. And in terms of like shadow systems, there appears to be a new kid on the block of shadow energy. And this is the whole data center conversation going on at the moment with AI and surveillance. In a way, it could be seen as the new military. It seems to be spreading like wildfire across the world. There's an interesting component here to do with water and data centers. And, big question is like, what are these things really? But what's fascinating, going to Gibraltar a couple of months ago, as I did, it feels like it's a very representative of our current times. Gibraltar feels like this huge convergence of so many things, like energies and cultures and history, just so much I'm going to be discussing. But it feels like we're in a period of time of convergence as well, where we have all these things coming to the surface in terms of the shadow aspects of the medical industry, financial, technology, entertainment, gender. Like, it feels everything is very strange, and everything's kind of upside down and being rearranged and being looked at, and light is being kind of shone on some of these shadow aspects of all of these things. And, again, how does that reflect from the human body? Because again, the way I see the world is that everything really is a projection of the human body. I mean, even if you look at popular culture, weird thing I've been thinking about recently is like celebrity culture. It seems very, very strange. And some of these people at the top of this kind of celebrity tree, which are, global names that loads of people know, tend to be musicians, or a lot of them are film stars. And then there's this very interesting Ozempic craze where suddenly all these people are getting super, super skinny and just looking very, very kind of quite drawn and not really human in so many ways. And it just feels like this kind of shadow aspect where everything feels very strange is sort of manifesting in the look of these individuals. And then you have to ask this question, I mean, because some of them are coming back looking completely different, maybe even having slightly different personalities and acting very strangely. And the way they speak seems very, very different. There's just so many cases of that, and it feels maybe a bit weird to kind of discuss this. But, it just kind of speaks to the fact that everything in our reality really is just kind of rearranging, and all these shadow aspects are kind of coming to the surface. And, I have big questions about who these individuals are. Are they even human? I don't know. But over, the course of my spiritual journey, I've always kind of tapped into, I guess, to those sort of new age concepts. It's kind of informed me quite a lot. And there's been a lot of talk for years now, really, of like purging the shadow and energies coming to the surface, and the elevation of everyone's consciousness. And to me, like over these last 10 years, it does feel like that has been rolling out. It feels like very, very real in my opinion. And it feels like, the world, myself, I've had loads of quite severe health problems. It feels like everyone is going through this like massive healing crisis on a personal level, but just also on the exterior level as well. Like it just feels like the world is just in constant fluctuation and, in chaos. And it does feel like there is a light at the end of the tunnel, like it is a process, and definitely going through this portal and this threshold again is quite painful, but I do feel like there is something quite beautiful at the other end of it. And again, I'm sort of going to mention the fact I just feel that the exterior world really is a manifestation of consciousness. So everything that's kind of happening is really a projection of our own consciousness and our own body. And, the vastness of our own consciousness, the vastness of our body is just, it's kind of like the TARDIS in my view. It's just never ending, really. And there is so much dark and there's so much light held within the very fabric of our body. And it's like everything really has kind of narrative. I've explained this before, where I feel that reality is in a constant feedback loop. So even if very bad things are happening, like you become ill, or with a particular condition, there's a reason for this. And it has taken me a while to kind of understand that, because it is quite frustrating, because you can be in the midst of illness, you could be in the midst of incredible pain, and it can go on for a long time. And yeah, when people say, well, you've got to heal yourself, it can be really triggering, really irritating, because it's like I'm trying to do everything I'm trying to think of, like physically, spiritually, but it's still not shifting. And yeah, when you're in that kind of like headspace, it's really hard to kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel. Um, but I just think that everything really does have an energetic component, even to the small things on a practical day-to-day level. Like when you're moving around, sometimes you might accidentally cut yourself or stub your toe. It all kind of links to something. Within my own kind of mechanics of my body, I've always sort of seen the left side of my body really as kind of feminine, the right side of my body as sort of masculine. And sometimes when I've had a predominant litany of different health problems on my left hand side of my body, which I have, I've always perceived it as really being linked to some aspects of my feminine nature, which are kind of slightly need healing. And then the same, vice versa with my right. And sometimes I can like constantly keep stubbing my right toe. And it's like, okay, something's going on here. This is kind of linking something to kind of masculine energies. And again, I don't want to like really dictate how your own body works, how your own consciousness works, because I think sometimes maybe there's a uniqueness within yourself. So it might not be the same for you. But this is what I've kind of discovered. I just feel like the human body really is just a map, and just, the way you feel in different parts of your body. Sometimes felt a lot of energy at the front of my body, but it's always felt very dull and sort of dulled down on my back. And I think that's kind of linked to something. I'm never quite sure what, and I'm still trying to unpick that. But it's just like everything has a reason in some strange way. But it's just not your own body. It's like the exterior world is constantly feeding back to you, whether that's through numbers or music you hear moving day to day. And obviously, everyone's very much glued to screens these days, including myself. So the algorithm, the internet, your YouTube feed or your social media feed, also messages are carried through that, or what films you watch or what TV series. Everything really has a message in there for you. And then obviously when you're going into nature, I think one of the purest synchronicities you can probably get are animals, and they can be birds and they can be insects. And I'm constantly having interactions with animals. And now I live in more of a rural area again in Spain, even more so now because I kind of moved into the forest. It's like a constant surrounded by nature and birds and trees. And again, it's that kind of shamanic experience of like, at the moment I have a constant problem with like mosquitoes coming into the house, or big ants, black ants, and everything really has a message behind it. And not a lot of the time, I'm not quite sure. So it's a point of divination where you're just going on the internet and putting, spiritual messages for ants. And then whatever you find on the internet in terms of an explanation could resonate with you, and that would probably be the reason. So I don't think it's necessary to sort of like catalog like a huge library of understanding of what every single animal means. You can quite easily kind of reference and research yourself and just kind of discover things. But yeah, I think as you do this more and more, like I'm starting to understand, like, birds sometimes can be a big warning for me. So when they start to nearly fly into me, or if I'm driving and they nearly fly into the car, I'm like, okay, something's going to happen quite soon. And inevitably something does unfold, which is not always like really, really bad, but there's a kind of warning, gear yourself up, something's going to change quite dramatically. I mean, going back to the body, and again, this could be very much specific to me because, again, I don't want to dictate how your body works. But I've had like a real issue with kind of the bottom half of my body has a very, very cold energy. And, apart from my health, I wanted to move to Spain where I am now, away from the UK, was a lot to do with like temperature as well. Because I can feel particularly when I'm sort of sat down at a desk at a computer like I am, I can just really start to feel the cold quite quickly. If I'm moving around, I'm sort of fine. But I've had this very, very cold energy in my legs and my feet. And again, I think this is kind of linking to something, to kind of darker energies, which I've been trying to unpick and sort of understand. And I do think some of these energies are now starting to kind of be transmuted, and I'm seeing a lot more movement, particularly in my legs and feet. So something is definitely happening with that. And then another kind of situation that happened recently, again, when I was actually in Gibraltar, which kind of links to that. That was really a lot of darker energy was coming from the center of my mind, my crown, my kind of, I guess, pineal gland in a way. I could sort of feel it. And it was sometimes it can feel so intense that I get a lot of pressure there as well. And I was walking around Gibraltar and I was climbing along these rocks, and I managed to sort of see this old disused, they look like satellite dishes pointing towards Morocco across the Strait of Gibraltar. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll just check that out, because there's a weird building next to it and it had a door that was ajar and open. And I walked in and it just had this, it was completely disused, and it had a rack of servers in there. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Anyway, as I came out, I just managed to like whack my head on some concrete, and it was the most painful thing. And it was like my eyes were watering. I felt like I wanted to cry because it was so painful. But again, it was a very painful reminder to sort of say, no, you've got a lot of darker energy around your pineal and your kind of crown area. And I think even just that kind of can't say it, that kind of conscious thought that is happening, it starts to shift things and starts to transmute it in a way. So it just brings your awareness to it, which kind of starts that process to really start to transmute it. And hopefully then it will start to disappear. And it did, it started to kind of move through. But a quick sort of life update, I guess some of these podcasts really, it's quite hard to divorce like my own life and my own experience from some of these things I'm researching now. Because I think actually sometimes like the viewer or the participant is as important as the information in many ways. So it's kind of like it becomes this like intermeshing sort of strand that kind of interweaves and mixes and yeah, all sorts of things. So I think it's important maybe to give context about what's going on with me at the moment. But yeah, I sort of moved to Spain last July, if you started listening, and it was mainly to try and sort of rectify health problems that I've been constantly having, particularly over the winter time. And so I ended up accidentally moving to the southwest tip of Spain, in a place called the Costa del Luz. And I had never really been to this area before, apart from we went for like a quick holiday, because I just felt this pull to a particular area of Spain when looking at a map. And so I went there and I was like, wow, it's just full of like really interesting history and just layers and layers of just fascinating energy. And I could feel it as soon as I went there. And as I'm trying to talk to you, there's another mosquito. God. I got this electrified bat, which kind of zaps them. Feels a bit harsh, but I can't do mosquitoes. Anyway, right, continue. Where was I? So I moved to Spain. Just looking at my notes. Yeah, there was just so much going on energetically, esoterically, and I've done a lot of videos to do with that and sort of written stuff of some of the strange stories and encounters. And I just found this place incredibly remarkable. I mean, I always thought, the UK had the market, cornered the market and paranormal activity and strangeness, but no, definitely Spain is given a run for its. I guess a lot of the European countries are like this because they just stretch back so far, because it has more of a visible like architecture and civilizations. I mean, you go into sort of towns in Spain, the stretches, they're some of the most oldest continuously inhabited civilizations ever in the whole world. that are still kind of running, and stretching all the way back to Phoenicians and stuff. And that's another interesting component, this whole Phoenician thing. There was a thing that I've been reading quite a lot through Michael Tazarian about sort of Britain and Ireland and the Phoenicians and how that kind of connects. And it was just, I was then going to these like very Phoenician, really ancient towns around the southwest of Spain. I thought it was a really fascinating synchronicity. And again, another aspect of just where I am, just this is a huge component sometimes when you go into places with so much light and so much energy. There always tends to be like military facilities there. And yeah, you can either look at it like they were consciously put there, or maybe they were unconsciously put there, because there's some force that kind of moves these shadow forces in certain places. And it's the same, when I've done videos of Rendlesham Forest all the way East Anglia. It's a very energetic place. There's just lots of, American bases there as well. It's a huge American presence there. Obviously ties into the Rendlesham Forest incident. And another favourite place of mine, Avebury, the whole Wiltshire. Again, there's just loads of military facilities around there. And this is repeated all over the world, even when I've gone to sort of California, and it's a very energetic place in America. And there's just lots of huge, obviously well-known military facilities around that area as well. And it's the same with Spain, all the way at the Coast of Light. There's Spanish military facilities, but also huge, massive, one of the biggest in Spain, I think, is in Rota, which is a US military base, naval base. And so that's probably about an hour and a half's drive away from here. So again, it just feels like some of these shadow systems are really sort of feeding off this light in some way. But I'm, been living in this past year in a place called Los Canos de Meca, and I unfortunately had to leave there just because the guy that I was renting off, because summer's like a big like holiday destination, so it's just strange. A lot of the rental places are very seasonal. You can kind of rent from September, and then June you have to sort of move out. And so I moved out, but I was having problems with like noisy neighbors as well, which is like another, spiritual aspect to like, why this is kind of a repeating pattern that's happened before with me, where you just feel like where I'm living is being invaded by someone else's music. And so in some ways I was sad to go, but other ways I was quite relieved. But I did this mammoth trip in my car, drove through all of like Spain up to the north to Bilbao, because I had my UK car and it had this inspection that needed to be done in order to be insured again. So I did this mammoth trip to go all the way back. And then I took the ferry from Bilbao, which then arrived into Portsmouth. And it was hilarious how I just sort of, obviously Spain weather's quite nice. It's hot and warm and sunny. And the same with when I got to Bilbao, even though it's further north, it was quite nice and clement. I was getting the ferry and it's beautiful skies. But as soon as you got closer and closer to the UK, it's just like the clouds descended. It was just like, again, sort of familiar 3-4 miles deep of like grey cloud. It just goes on forever and it just sort of hangs in the air for weeks, for months. And it was another one of the reasons why I just felt like I had to leave. And it's just very strange, as like heavy cloud that just sort of sits there all the time. And then again, the weather just got more and more tumultuous and stormy and stuff. And it was just like, yeah, welcome home, Simon. But, arrived into Portsmouth. So I've been to Portsmouth before, but never from the context of like taking a ferry there. And it's just fascinating sort of seeing the skyline again. I think it's one of the biggest like naval kind of facilities. The British Navy is there, and yeah, just a lot of sort of naval frigates and other kind of warships, whatever you call them. It's a big kind of naval shipyard there, basically. But it's fascinating because a lot of like the UK, like every time I come across some of these military facilities, they look like they're falling apart. It doesn't look like anyone's really there. So I don't think we have any real kind of military to kind of speak of, even though, the rhetoric sometimes of these politicians, like, we're going to go to war with Russia. And it's like, are you joking? I mean, Russia's probably got this humongous army with like endless tanks, endless soldiers, endless kind of naval ships everywhere. And like UK, we've got nothing. And I'm not like a proponent of having a big military, but it's kind of quite comical the way they sort of like act like they have this huge kind of military to back up the works, because they just don't. I just feel just like everywhere I come across in the UK, it's just either been mothballed or it just looks like it's fallen apart. Which is also another kind of interesting thought experiment. Are these data centers in some kind of strange way, like the kind of the child of the old kind of military facility in a way. And it's just kind of the new shadow system, and the military's going to sort of disintegrate, and it's all really going to be digital. It's all going to be surveillance. And this is kind of like the new shadow system that's being installed across the world to kind of manage the light, manage the energy. So that is an interesting thought experiment I have been sort of thinking about. But again, everything that's unfolding, including like the AI, like, to my point of view, it has like a link back to consciousness and some of this crazy weather. I know there's been a lot of rhetoric in the news about it being 40 degrees. And my dad was saying that in an email recently, but I went on the weather and it just seemed like it was like 30 degrees in the UK. I couldn't see any temperatures that were 40. Where I am, Los Canas de Mecca, again, I was seeing all these weather warnings. It's like 23 degrees. So I'm just like, oh, is this another kind of weird weather fear porn? But I would admit that definitely the weather just feels a lot more fluctuating these days. But I think it really kind of links back to consciousness in kind of some strange way as the shadows coming up, and particularly the UK feels so heavy. I just think there's a transmutation, some really heavy energies within that country at the moment. Hello. This is a quick commercial interlude. I just want to tell you about my t-shirt shop where I have conscious creations of some of the scribbles and artwork that I've done. I basically put them on t-shirts, which you can wear day or night, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. But you can go to reconsidersimon.com and you can click on the banner there, which will take you to my Etsy shop. And it's a great way to support me. Thank you so much. Bye. But yeah, now I'm back in Spain. My car died, unfortunately. So that's an end of an era. It was worth way too much to get it fixed. So I'll kind of come back to Spain. Probably been here about 3 weeks, I think now. And thankfully I've kind of settled a bit more. I've got a place for the summer. I bought a Spanish car. So I just feel a lot more rooted and a bit more, because it just felt crazy before. Because I was like, went back to the UK, I was like, go. And then I had loads of stuff in storage. I need to sort of sort through and kind of throw stuff away, sell stuff. And it's just been on a constant go. And then as soon as I got back to Spain, it was like, I've got to find somewhere to live and I've got to buy a car. So it's all these kind of one thing after another. And just like this week, I'm like, feels like in a better place now. Everything's kind of a bit more organized and I feel a bit more rested. So it feels like I can do a bit more content again, which is good. So normal service will resume. But yeah, before I left, I guess now it's about 2 months ago, I decided to take an impromptu trip to Gibraltar. Because I didn't realize I never really checked how far away it was. I'd seen it on the map, but I didn't realize how close it was. And it was only about an hour and a half. And I was like, I could just do that in a day. But I decided to sort of stay overnight. So I stayed on the Spanish side and just decided to kind of walk across into Gibraltar, because it is kind of cheap if you stay on the Spanish side. And I remember going there like many years ago, I think way over 10 years ago, with a girlfriend that I was living with in London at the time. And she was French and she kind of hated the British weather. She's always complaining about it. So I thought, well, maybe we could live in Gibraltar. And they sort of speak English and it'll be easy for me to move there. And then as a designer, freelance designer, there seems to be lots of work with financial companies and gambling companies and stuff. So yeah, maybe you can go there. So we decided to take, I think it was around about April time, we decided to sort of fly there. But actually the weather when we got there wasn't that great initially, but I think it did sort of brighten up. But it was interesting. I didn't really like it. I just felt really quite industrial. And at the time, I was quite into my food. So we were going to a lot of restaurants. I was cooking a lot, and I just felt the food was like, British food from 20 or 30 years ago. It's just quite depressing. Just this constant smell of sort of stale fat. And I just wasn't very particularly impressed by it at all. And I was like, yeah, there's no way I could live here. So that was kind of, at the time, it was completely off the table. But having returned, and again, this is a big block of time since I went there. Again, I'm guessing about over 10 years ago, if not more. I completely changed my opinion. It just felt like everything had sort of improved massively. I think there's been a lot of development. It just everything felt better. And maybe it was the person I was with at the time. Maybe she was quite sort of negative. So again, that's that idea of like, how, the energy that you're emitting sort of really just affects the exterior environment. But maybe I feel a lot better and more positive energetically. It's kind of, Gibraltar's changed quite significantly as well. So that could be a part of it in some strange way. But yeah, like, the 2 days that I spent there, I was like, yeah, I could quite easily live here. I won't because it's a little bit too hectic for me at the moment. But yeah, genuinely, I really, really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the energy. But, a lot of this audio podcast is all about the convergence, the threshold, a portal, whatever you want to describe it. It's just kind of this meeting point, these two contrasting opposing forces or concepts or energies. And there's just so much like that in Gibraltar. It's really bizarre. And you have the Atlantic Ocean, which stretches on for miles and miles. And back in the olden days in the ancient world, it was always perceived as being the end of the world. And obviously, they found out later on, in terms of like the known Western world at the moment, obviously, there's been ancient civilizations and stuff, and continents have moved around. But what we're told is that, the Atlantic Ocean was just, there was nothing and there was no land at the end of it and you'd fall off the edge of the earth. That's the kind of the narrative you're given. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But it is a convergence of the Atlantic Ocean, which is unknown kind of world. And again, sort of feeding in the ideas of like the old gods. It was perceived as not meant for mortal humans. This was the era of the gods. So don't go there. And the exotic world of the Mediterranean Sea. So again, it's that kind of joining of these two oceanic environments. And the Mediterranean Sea is just like abundant, with so much like exotic spices and exotic places. It's the sort of gateway to Africa. It's a gateway to so many beautiful landscapes in the Mediterranean European region. So yeah, again, a threshold, a portal, whatever you want to describe it as. And then Gibraltar itself is it's a bordering town. So weirdly, Gibraltar, even though it's part of Britain, it does feel like its own country, and it has many different systems which are completely different. Like I thought, again, going back to my car, like I may get my car MOT'd in Gibraltar. You can't because it's a completely different system. The post offices aren't linked to the post office in the UK. So in many ways, it's its own weird little country, but it's bordering Spain, and it's this kind of threshold as this tension between the Spanish side and the Gibraltar side, which is obviously part of the UK. But I made, a few short videos on this, and in terms of the landscape, Gibraltar, there's this very phallic, masculine presence, this kind of like limestone monolith that's sort of hollow inside, which is another fascinating aspect to this. And then you look at the Spanish side, it's flat, very, very flat. So again, you've got this huge contrast in the landscape itself, and just the landscape itself, it just looks, masculine. The Gibraltar's masculine, and a feminine kind of Spanish side is, feminine in so many ways, but it's also just influenced the name as well, because it's called, the town itself is La Línea de Concepción, which kind of relates to the Mother Mary. So even in the name on the Spanish side, it has a feminine kind of name. And in terms of like the activity, Gibraltar is just like real hive of like capitalism, and actually it's one of the healthiest in terms of, if your metric is money and commerce, then yeah, Gibraltar looks relatively successful. Because when I was walking around, I didn't see any kind of boarded up shops. Everyone was like buzzing around. They had kind of a slight London energy. When I was younger, I used to really love going to London just because of that go like energy. And there's just so much going on, and you're sort of going on the tube and process through these different environments. It feels like future, very, very futuristic in many ways. And kind of Gibraltar has that same sort of buzzy energy. But if you go to a majority of places in the UK, it's not like that. You go to some sort of, even where I'm coming from, Chester, there's just a lot of boarded up shops, like areas which are completely just not used anymore. It's very representative of what's going on in the UK. It's a very heavy, depressing energy. It just feels very, I don't know, just stagnant, really. And so this is kind of replicated in so many different small towns and cities around the UK at the moment, I think. So Gibraltar is very, very different. It still feels very buzzy. It feels very kind of like, things are happening. But, in terms of like some of the main industries in this real, and it is small. And what's fascinating is just like probably one of the most, uneasy places to build, because again, you've got this limestone and it's quite steep all the way down to the kind of the sea area. And I think it's more towards the tip overlooking the Strait of Gibraltar. It starts to get a bit more flatter. I know they're starting to kind of reclaim land. They've always sort of already built a marina. It's quite nice around there. I think they've been reclaiming more land and sort of building skyscrapers, not skyscrapers, but quite tall buildings anyway. So where was I going with that? Yeah. So in terms of like some of the industries, again, you have this, it's a hive of like finance, shipping, the Strait of Gibraltar. I think it's probably one of the most busiest shipping lanes in the world. I know there's a lot of information to do with the Strait of Hormuz, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, to do with the Iran conflict and this being this main kind of nodal point of like the flow of oil to the rest of the world and things. And, Gibraltar's another point like that, not specifically oil, though, although I without a doubt assume there's a lot of oil tankers go through there, but it is huge kind of gateway to, Africa and Europe and North America, South America, this kind of Strait of Gibraltar. You can just feel it, like the importance of it. And it looks stunning. Like when I was there those couple of days, the light was so stunning. It was like crystalline, and like looking over the ocean out into Africa and to Morocco, it's just really, really beautiful sight. And you can just imagine historically some of the mariners, in these ancient civilizations going on their sailing boats, or maybe they had boats that had different propulsion, I don't know. But you can just imagine them being in awe as well, like I was in awe. It is a very, very like interesting convergence again. So you have all these industries, including like the military. Military is a huge thing. Gambling is a huge thing. As a designer, I've done sort of work for various gambling companies. Poker Stars is always quite a favorite. It was a place I went back to freelance quite a few times. And I always really enjoyed it. And I know Poker Stars, I think, was in Gibraltar as well. But anyway, so you got Gibraltar. It's a very like, phallic penis, like it's limestone. There's always like, go-getting, like masculine sort of companies there, corporations there. And then you look on the Spanish side, again, it's very flat. Everything's more spaced out. Everything has air to breathe. And again, even the name, it's like the Virgin Mary. Obviously, it kind of relates to the Catholic faith and the Catholic traditions. But Jesus was obviously made through this process called Immaculate Conception. So he was basically born through not having sex. So conceived without sin, because obviously having sex is very, very bad and ungodly. I would say that is without a doubt very, very wrong. But that's the way they kind of read the situation. And the feminine, in terms of my experiences over these last few years, over these last decade, have very much involved the feminine, whether in terms of like actual physical people having these very, very powerful experiences, or just in the landscape or kind of culturally. And Spain is just another huge synchronicity in that, because there is so much kind of feminine aspect to Spain in terms of like the Virgin Mary. There are so many places kind of relates to kind of feminine goddesses and feminine Christian figures. And this has been a huge unfoldment that's been happening for me. And this is why I'm going to probably do another podcast on that, because there's so much, and particularly a lot of the churches and cathedrals in Spain don't tend to focus on Jesus. It's always kind of Mary or a feminine figure. That's kind of the idolatry that they have. And I think this kind of stretches all the way back to sort of Celtic times. They've sort of managed to maintain this kind of feminine aspect within their religious traditions. Whereas you look at like the UK, most churches and cathedrals, it's always about Jesus. And it's very, very rarely you see kind of Mary or a feminine presence. It tends to be, sometimes you get it in the stained glass window, but it's that Protestant, very, very kind of masculine approach to kind of Christianity. And again, this is another threshold that I've just understood. You have kind of, when Spain and Britain have been at war, or France, you have these feminine-based countries. France is the same and Spain is the same. And this kind of relates to the Battle of Trafalgar, which happens outside of Los Canos de Meca. And then you have this Protestant country, very, very masculine. So it's just interesting how, again, this masculine and feminine thing just kind of weaves through everything, through the landscape, and it just seems to affect history as well. And obviously on the micro level, in terms of like interpersonal relationships with, one another, men and women, it's just everything is this kind of, masculine and feminine energy kind of intertwining and sometimes clashing at the same time. But from my own point of view and experience, sort of been in many different landscapes now around the world, and there just seems to be an interesting correlation. When you have a predominant area of like flat land, and you have this sudden just kind of strutting out of this like phallic, I don't know, hill or rock or mountain or whatever it is, it seems to be quite, an interesting energy. It's the energy around that landscape tends to be very, very interesting, very, very powerful. And also found the inverse is true. So if you have like an area that's very, very mountainous, very, very hilly, and then you have like a small area of like flat land, which kind of looks at odds with the rest of the landscape, again, it feels like it's a nodal point of some quite special energy. And that, without a doubt, is happening within Gibraltar. I mean, I've seen it in so many places, like places I've been in Africa, places, around the world that I've encountered where you have this kind of huge contrast. It does seem to create something in the landscape. Well, it's representing the energy really. So it's like the physical landscape is being shaped by the energy behind it. So again, that physical realm really is a manifestation of what is representative of the energy. And so, Gibraltar being this masculine force and the Spanish being this feminine force is very representative of what is happening now. Really, I think, because it really links to now. Because at the moment, if you go online, particularly in the internet space, there's just so much chaos and so much shedding about what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman, and just kind of that combative interplay that seems to be happening. And that's another weird one, in the fact that on the internet or the digital space, everything's sort of hyper real, like everything's intensified to kind of a million. So in some ways it doesn't feel real, because if you sort of walk around, normal, the exterior world, even though, in many ways that is sort of an illusion, it's very different. You're not having these combative sort of men and women at each other's throats. It's just different. It's just like normal life. So again, it's just the internet's strange, it's like this hyper real environment. But through this, threshold, this contrast between this masculine, this feminine, these two countries that have been at war for hundreds of years, a lot of these settlements wouldn't exist. Gibraltar wouldn't exist. The Spanish town wouldn't be as big as it is now without that constant like interplay and combative nature of these two energies. And, before, like, Spain had this permanent fort of military, obviously on the border of Gibraltar, as to push the British forces away. It's like a constant threshold, a barrier to prevent any more of them sort of coming into Spain itself. And then that military like settlement has grown into a normal settlement where people live, where people have jobs, where they have families. And, when I was on the Spanish side, I didn't really see any military aspects at all. It's more on the British side. So without that, what's an interesting, you've had that kind of conflict and this tension has created this very, very strange prosperity in a way. And it's become quite symbiotic, because you have a lot of people who live on the Spanish side. They will travel every day across the threshold into Britain, into Gibraltar to work, and then they'll come back at the end of the day. Because I get the sense, obviously, maybe some of the jobs in Gibraltar would be better paid. And also there's probably more of an abundance of work in Gibraltar, being a more capitalist society. So it's like this warring conflict in a way has just created a strange prosperity. And it's just, inadvertent consequence of the shadow sometimes, that sometimes good aspects do kind of come out of it, which is strange to say, but, that sometimes can be the truth. And obviously it's very, very strategic. Let's not forget that. That is an element to this, because Gibraltar overlooks the Strait of Gibraltar, incredibly important shipping canal, which I've already said, but it's just a gateway to Europe. It's the gateway to, North America. It's the gateway to Africa. There's all these different environments, all these different kind of spheres of like human reality exist. And it's that kind of nexus point where they all seem to meet. So for Britain, it's an incredibly important foothold. And to have that, and I can't ever really see them ever giving that up. And I can't really ever see Spain wanting to try militarily take it over. I just can't see that happening, because it feels so embedded, like that now, the two cultures, the way it's sort of set up. I could be wrong, but yeah, I can see the strategic nature of it, why the British wanted to hold on to this small speck of land for so long. And it is tiny if you look at it. And then esoterically, is there something going on here? Like energetically, they understand that they have to have a foothold here as well to kind of power, every country in so many ways is like a shadow system in its own right. It tends not to really like serve the people, broader people. It tends to serve special interests, richer people, and UK and Spain are no different in that regard. But it just feels, some of these shadow systems need the light of Gibraltar to be able to power itself and to be able to kind of, maintain its aspect in everyone's consciousness. And because of that light, this is why you have all these shadow systems in terms of finance and gambling and, shipping, maybe, sometimes there's shadow aspects in that as well. And obviously the military, all of these things are kind of feeding off that feminine creation energy, that creation energy current. So again, that kind of very masculine go-getting energy, which, in the UK is very prevalent. It just, even when I went back, I felt it, it's just like, go, go, go. It's just like one thing after another. Okay, once I've done this, I've got to do that. And it's just like a constant conveyor belt of things you have to do. And so it's very representative in the country. Now, I have kind of thought, why in the UK being such a small country, like why do we have this predilection wanting to sort of travel and go to other cultures? And obviously in the sort of in the past to colonize, sort of, oh, we're going to make another England here. And there's always been, I think it stretches back to the Phoenicians because they were a huge seafaring sort of civilization. So there's an energy in the land of the UK that seems to want to make people to explore, but also to colonize in some kind of strange way. And I think it comes from the energy in the land and maybe stretches back to the Phoenicians because the Phoenicians had that same predilection to kind of move and travel, and they set up civilizations all over the world, including Spain potentially and other areas of the Middle East. And they from what I've read in some of Michael Dzarian's work, I haven't really read outside of him, admittedly, but they were just very, very advanced civilization. They knew about naval kind of technology. They knew about astrology. And, what else did they know? Did they have sort of hidden knowledge to do with spirituality, about reality and, hidden knowledge, basically, the whole mystery school thing. So UK as a whole can very much be described as a very masculine-based society. And then you look at Spain, it's very, very different. Work does exist, but I get the sense that, having 2 hours over lunch, here shops close at 2 o'clock and they'll open at 5. So people take a long time to sort of have their lunch and relax with their families. And then there's another aspect I like about Spain is the fact I'm not really spending that much money here because the weather's good and it's very for me, it's an outdoor culture and there's like forests and there's seas. And so I've got quite into surfing and things. And predominantly Spanish people tend to sort of go to the beaches and they'll go with their families and they'll set up a huge encampment with various umbrellas. And they'll be there for hours and they'll have chairs and they'll bring loads of food. They don't have the whole barbecue thing here because I think because of the hot weather, it kind of can cause forest fires and things. So they tend not to do that. But yeah, without a doubt, Spain's famous for the idea of siestas, sort of taking it easy. So it's very much imbued in the energy of the land. So again, that's kind of informing like how the people act here. And it's the same with me. Like definitely I'm working less here than ever. And sometimes I have this tension within myself because I'm like, I should be doing something and I need to be achieving, I need to be creating. And so it's just something I'm really trying to learn to kind of relax, go for walks, go to the beach every day for an hour, just soak up the rays, just relax. It is quite hard for me sometimes. But it's fascinating how, again, these energies really are manifested in the religious context as well. Like I said, with the UK, you go to even just the churches and cathedrals, the medieval ones, they look more, even though they're beautiful, they look way more just utilitarian. And then obviously you're going to sort of more of the Latin-y cultures like Italy and Spain and France. I mean, some of the cathedrals and churches are just so ornately decorated. Again, I would say actually Spain's probably quite simple in terms of the architecture. But it's just this idol worship in terms of like the Mother Mary being really focused and central to a lot of the religious kind of traditions. And particularly over Easter, I didn't really get, it's called like Holy Week. But a lot of the churches and cathedrals all around Spain, they have these huge processions. You've probably seen videos online where there's sort of people, and it happens like every day at different points. And there's always kind of a ritual or a story behind it. And they'll carry these huge feminine figures with, Mother Mary and ornately decorated into sort of gold and amazing kind of clothing and things. And some of the people carrying them it looks a little bit like the Ku Klux Klan, which is kind of unfortunate. And they are part of a brotherhood, but obviously the Ku Klux Klan sort of whole thing has really tarnished that sort of visual, really, because it kind of people have been obviously visually repelled by that when you see these people wearing these pointy hoods. They immediately go to the American South and the Ku Klux Klan, but it's obviously not to do with that at all. So yeah, you get these very strange hooded figures like carrying these feminine characters through these streets, these very narrow streets within various Spanish towns across Spain. So yeah, again, this kind of feminine aspect is throughout society. And I would hazard a guess maybe it's more matriarchal in terms of the way your families are set up. Or maybe the grandmothers and the wives are way more in charge of families than might have been in the past in the UK, where it could be more of a patriarchal kind of setup within families. But I think, a lot of this relates back to that kind of it's a strange term, Celtic times, pre-Celtic times, because it doesn't really, not very descriptive, and it sort of encompasses so many different civilizations and stuff. But it's a kind of broad phrase for a very, very diverse kind of culture. But I think it does stretch back to that era, whatever you want to describe it as. And those traditions did happen in the UK, I think, particularly some of the videos I did in Chester, where there's like the Minerva statue next to the River Dee, which is supposed to be a Roman goddess, but probably would predate that. It was probably, I think there's the DC Angli tribe and the Cornovi tribe that were around that particular Chester area, and they had, goddesses, the River Dee, there's a name that links to a goddess apparently, and even Diva Fort, the Diva Fort, which is the Roman name for Chester, is a Roman is a goddess name, obviously Diva. So it is there, but it's just been lost, through the current religious traditions of the Protestant church and stuff. A lot of these things have been completely stripped away. And then obviously, again, I think Airfen's another goddess within Chester as well. So, and I found this strange alignment between all of these kind of quite important, the Duke of Westminster, the Minerva statue, Chester Cathedral, and various other kind of stately homes. It all seemed to be in a line. And very close to that, it went straight through the military barracks of Chester as well. And it's just like, there's a big question is like, were these things done consciously? Did they understand something? Or is it completely unconscious? The shadow system sort of placing these shadow aspects, whether it would be like, the largest landowner in the UK, the Duke of Westminster, in line with Chester Cathedral, in line with military barracks. Whether that was kind of more unconscious rather than that kind of a conscious placement. And just bringing the conversation back to where I'm at the moment in Los Canos de Mecca, I should say, I think it's in Spanish, it's Las Caños de Mecca. But the rough translation of that is like pipes of peace, I guess, or pipes of paradise, or canals of paradise, whichever way you want to kind of structure it. But yeah, this is a name given to this area by the Moors because it has very deeply spiritual spring water that flow underneath of these lands, why I think this area is so energetic. And there's so much kind of interesting things that have happened around this area in terms of like UFOs, apparitions, like ghostly apparitions. And, being here, it's very, very healing place for me personally. There's been a lot of interesting, quite painful energies, shadow energies that have definitely come up. And that's something I'm still dealing with. But overall, I found this place incredibly energetic, and it's without a doubt be instrumental in my healing process as well. But what's been strange about this, I moved to this area completely by accident. I was looking, quite a broad stretch of coastline really. And I just happened to come across this place that this guy was renting, and it was an area I'd never been to before. So when I went to go and check out this apartment, it's the first time I ever went to this town. I was like, oh, this is interesting. It's quite nice. It's a little bit disheveled in some ways, but the kind of the natural environment around it is really stunning in terms of like the beach and the kind of forest around it as well. Really, really beautiful. Even though the town itself is not particularly like picture postcard, like, specific. But one thing that I uncovered about this area was just a lot of the place names. Like I was living in this kind of strange gated community called an urbanization, which is quite typical in Spain. And it was called the Cabo de Trafalgar, which is, translates as the Cape of Trafalgar. And little did I know that this whole area, or that coastline, was kind of the theatre of the huge historical conflict of the Battle of Trafalgar, which is between Napoleon. So it's a combined Spanish and French forces, Napoleon against, the Battle of Trafalgar and Lord Nelson. And in this point, it was a very bloody battle that went on for hours, I think about 6 hours. And, hundreds, if not thousands of sailors died, and a lot of their bodies were washed up on shore all the way along the coastline, apparently. And there's a lot of ghost stories linked to that. People saying they hear cries and naval sort of echoes of naval warfare happening. And also people feel the tugging at each other's clothes. And having thought about it, and I mean, that is another aspect to this area that I found fascinating, is the amount of mysterious booms that I hear. And a lot of people attribute it to the military activity. But yeah, maybe some of these are ghostly apparitions of war. I don't know. But anyway, I just find it fascinating that you have this instrumental naval conflict, being British, and this is, Britain against Spain. It's just literally on my doorstep. So I found that fascinating. And having lived in London and walked through Trafalgar Square so many times in the daytime, in various drunken states after going to, like, I don't know, Chinatown after meeting friends and things. Yeah, it's just weird. And, back the Gibraltar links to that, because a lot of the dead, or some of the dead that were collected, or the injured from this great naval warfare, were taken to Gibraltar. So you can, when you go there, there's a really old cemetery kind of right slap bang in the middle of the town, it feels. And it's quite beautiful and tranquil, even though it's very like heavily built up. It's got trees, but a lot of the sailors are built sort of buried there itself. So again, it's just strange how the two link up. There's another aspect to this in terms of like the old gods and this area like Gibraltar being perceived as being Hades, like the gates to kind of hell or the underworld. And I'm living in Canos de Mecca, which is, paradise. So it's like heaven in some ways. And again, this is another strange threshold that I've sort of just realized. I was like, oh my God, you got sort of the gates of hell down here, and then you've got like heaven here. Really bizarre. But again, coming back to this narrative of like feminine, masculine, like I was speaking about, it's the marrying up of Spanish and French forces, more sort of feminine. And then in terms of like the UK being more masculine with the Protestant aspect to it. And it really just feeling like the war of the sexes. You have this like feminine force, distorted feminine force fighting this distorted masculine force. So again, it just feels like that interplay of the two energies is just kind of happening on a larger theatre of war. It's really, really bizarre. Within UK, I think that many of the statues do with Mary, in fact, any feminine goddesses references were, completely destroyed, which is what, relating back to Chester, it's strange actually how that statue has maintained to be there. It's kind of survived a lot of the wiping away of historical accounts, the wiping away of history, the wiping away of statues and idolatry that are perceived as being sinful. Yeah, it's strange that the Minerva statue in Chester is kind of still there. But Spain and France, they sort of managed to keep this kind of feminine presence still, even though it's distorted. It's still kind of there. It's ingrained within the culture itself. And apparently Spain is called the land of Lady. Sorry, I said that again. I said it wrong. Spain is called the land of Mary, and this is the way it's kind of perceived. And France is the eldest daughter of the church. So yeah, again, it's just like this feminine aspect relating to Christianity, which probably stretches way back into kind of more Celtic times. And yeah, without a doubt, there's distortions within Protestantism, and also absolutely within Catholicism, particularly with the Vatican. Obviously, everyone knows the conspiracies about the Vatican and things. There's the Vatican Bank, and all these very conspiratorial ideas. Vatican being a country in its own right. And if you're thinking of the world as a kind of deep state thing, it seems to be like the religious center of, is the Vatican, the city of London being the money aspect, and Washington, again, has a strange area where it's perceived as being an independent country with the United States. And that's like the military aspect. And again, with like Switzerland, you have all these like banking, the International Bank of Settlements, which controls all the central banks around the world. WEF, like all of these large institutions are in Switzerland, and again, seem to be weirdly their own country in their own right. So yeah, without a doubt, all of these systems have distortions, including the church, but it's just incredibly poetic and beautiful in some instances where, you're having this war, this conflict, but, on the surface, if you really go back to the energy, it just feels like feminine distorted, masculine distorted, that are kind of war with each other. And it's just, this is a thing that's been unfolding throughout, centuries, if not longer. And it feels like it's always been there within the culture. There's kind of tussle between men and women as well on the micro level. But yeah, some of the understanding about the Battle of Trafalgar and the feminine masculine, there's just loads of synchronicities that have been happening apart from that. I could go on forever talking about this, which is why I want to do a few more podcasts. But it just feels like I'm on this strange alchemical biblical journey at the moment where all these things are like unfolding at the moment. It's very, very peculiar, very interesting, fascinating, quite exciting. But it's taken my life in a direction I never thought I would be going into because, previous to that, I'd always sort of started off with the whole, UFOs and aliens and coming from different star systems. And I'm not sort of discounting that, but I think there's probably a lot of false information in some of these concepts to do with like aliens and an extraterrestrial craft or interdimensional craft and everything. I'm sort of really focused on, my exterior world at the moment, my own internal world. I think that's at the moment one of the most important things. And some of these larger things like disclosure actually are really huge distraction and aren't helpful, and I actually think are weaponized in so many ways to sort of get people to look outside of themselves too much. And so I'm really just focusing on my own journey and some of the synchronicities that are coming up. I noticed some of the synchronicities have been so huge and so out there. Even just like people I've known, some of these romantic relationships, their names and how it kind of relates into some Gnosticism. It's just mind blowing what's been happening. So, given that what I've just said, in essence, going back to Gibraltar, it feels like, it is a very living threshold between masculine and feminine energies in an allegorical way. It's that energetic undercurrent is really informing what's happening in the landscape, but also in the way how people interact with each other when they're there. But going back to La Linea Conception, the Spanish bordering town of Gibraltar, and it gets its name from the Mother Mary, and the Mother Mary is really, really important to the Spanish military, and sort of I think it stretches it all the way back to like the 16th, 15th century. It's been for hundreds of years where they've had a real reverence for the Virgin Mary, and apparently doing some research, it all stretches back to a particular war where the Spanish were fighting the Dutch in Flanders in 1585. Now, apparently, Spanish forces at the time became trapped on a hill, and Dutch warships started to open river dikes around that particular area, around the 5,000 Spanish soldiers, specifically to drown the Spanish soldiers. I think the initial intention of the Dutch military forces was really to scare the Spanish into submission. So the intention was to kill them, but I think really to get them to surrender, really. So the Dutch asked for surrender, but the Spanish response, this is the quote that I got, was the Spanish infantry preferred death to dishonor. We'll talk of surrender after we're dead. So whether that was the narrative across all of the soldiers and it wasn't just like some very, very headstrong sort of officers, I don't know. But yeah, that's basically what happened. So the Dutch opened the various dikes to kind of flood. But at the very last minute, a Spanish soldier was digging a trench and uncovered a wooden panel with a picture of Mary, the Virgin Mary. And all of them saw this as a hugely divine sign and started praying to Mother Mary. What happened as the waters that were beginning to rise, from the Dutch opening these river dikes, that completely abnormally, the surrounding river, after the Spanish had found the Virgin Mary and started to pray to Mary, the whole surrounding river froze solid overnight. So it meant that the Spanish were able to walk over the river and destroy the Dutch ships that were actually kind of encased in this ice. So ever since this particular conflict, obviously an amazing turn of events, Immaculate Conception has been perceived as the patron saint of the Spanish army specifically because of this story. Even the Dutch forces and the officer could see that a miracle had happened. They were quite blown away themselves and conceded that the Spanish forces were being protected by some other kind of saintly, Christ-like energy. So ever since that particular story, La Linea de Conception, the Virgin Mary, has been incredibly important to the Spanish military, and obviously it's why this Spanish bordering town of Gibraltar has its name. And yeah, it's why, again, I think why the Virgin Mary is so revered across the country still. So you have this feminine border, but as a whole, in terms of if you stretch back and look at Gibraltar historically, and again, I'm sort of weaving some of the mainstream understanding, maybe some aspects of this could be wrong. But it's been occupied for over, I think it's like 100,000 years. I don't know how correct that is. That's what I kind of found on the internet when I did some research, from more kind of mainstream sources. But there's a very famous Neanderthal cave that's been discovered within, the sort of the limestone itself, and it has like various kind of very rudimentary art within the cave itself, and there's various like evidence of food sources. I think various kind of deer and sea snails that have been found in some of these caves to sort of link them to Neanderthals. But bringing it more into the future, again, I talked about the Phoenicians, and so the Phoenicians had a god shrine within Gibraltar itself, which was seen as many of these cultures have perceived Gibraltar being very, very special. And in a lot small space, there's a lot has been going on, and there's just so many layers to this as well. And it apparently is one of the most fought after bits of land in human history, ever. There's been so many conflicts for this small speck of land. And then bringing it historically forward a bit to the Romans, they called it Hollow Mountain or Mons Culpa. And Mons Culpa, there's like an interesting sort of, it looks a bit cheesy, but there's a kind of strange sculpture near the kind of coastal area of Gibraltar that overlooks the Strait of Gibraltar. I'm not sure if it was like funded by Freemasons, but it has Mons Culpa on it, and it's perceived to be the sort of the pillars of Hercules, which is also really important. Sometimes you hear variations on the story, but essentially, Gibraltar being the pillar, one of the pillars of Hercules, and the other one is on the African side in Morocco. And so, you go back to Plato, again, this brings into narrative to do with like lost civilizations, whether that's Atlantis or something else. But Plato always perceived Atlantis being beyond the pillars of Hercules. And, within the name, within etymology, you have the Atlantic Ocean and Atlantis. So I know there's lots of stories about Atlantis being all over the place. I've mentioned this before. Some sort of think that the Eye of the Sahara, that's Atlantis. It's got these concentric circles. But there's a lot of legends to do with like Atlantis being off the Spanish coast, and the same with like Ireland. If I'm bringing some of Michael Tazarian's work as well, he sort of talked about Atlantis and lost civilizations, then moving to Ireland after these kind of cataclysms or, huge earth-changing sort of seismic events, whether it's flooding or something else. But yeah, we're bringing into America, there's also stories about Florida. So it just feels like, and even the Caribbean as well. So it just feels like that Atlantic oceanic region, there's just a lot of mystery and myth surrounding this Atlantis kind of story. But going back to this Mons Culpa, this hollow mountain, is one of the biggest features of Gibraltar is the tunnels. And, there's lots of mystery surrounding this, how deep do these tunnels go? And there's lots of interesting conspiracies to do with like ancient tunnels. So yeah, that's a huge aspect of Gibraltar. And it's one of the reasons why I think strategically the British have been able to hold on to the island as well. Well, it's not an island, but the kind of the Cape of Gibraltar, they've been able to hold on to it because of this cave system that's been used so much within the military, and being able to bury themselves in this limestone fortress in a way. But in terms of some of the known sort of civilizations that have used and inhabited Gibraltar or had reverence for Gibraltar, like I said, it's the Phoenicians, it's the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Vandals, the Moors, obviously, again, Spain, the Dutch, and now, the British have had control of Gibraltar since 1704, and then again, I think 1713. And ever since then onwards, it's been part of Britain. But, talking about sort of Islam and the Moors, when they had a lot of control over parts of Spain, Gibraltar's no different. And it's still evident in the traditions and some of the architecture around Spain, but also kind of at Gibraltar itself. So there's like a Moorish castle which still is there, which you can visit. I didn't go inside, but I kind of looked at it from the outside. And then on the kind of I think it's called Europa Point, there's a mosque there as well, very beautiful looking mosque. So still kind of that Islam is very, very important to this land as well. And it's been there for a very, very long time, as well as Christianity. And that within that fully functioning mosque, Europa Point, it's also the point of like the lighthouse as well, which is very kind of protruding phallic object, which sort of helps mariners kind of navigate. Less so now, obviously, because a lot of the kind of navigation tools are electronic, but lighthouse is incredibly important in the ancient world. but focusing on this Europa point, which is this area of flat land I talked about, which kind of overlooks the Strait of Gibraltar and this kind of allegorical kind of pillars of Hercules with this mosque on it. It has like a big sports center there as well. It looked like people were kind of playing football, but it's one of the only areas of like continuous flat land that you can kind of walk around. But it's been continuously sacred apparently for about 700 years. And if it wasn't a shrine to Islam, it's been a shrine to other things as well. They had this thing called the perpetual flame, which kept burning for years, for decades, for centuries, to help seafarers looking for protection as they cross, the sacred pillars of Hercules from the Mediterranean Sea into the Atlantic Ocean. And this name, Europa Point, is very, very important to the naming of the continent of Europe. I mean, this is apparently why Europe is called Europe, is because of this small speck of land within Gibraltar itself called Europa Point was the inspiration to call the continent of Europe as well, which I guess, how do you perceive? Obviously, Europe is kind of the name for the landmass in a way, but it also kind of fits towards this political system. Previously, before, I was always quite pro the idea of the European Union, but I like a lot of governmental structures and corporations. I'm kind of quite anti it these days. So again, how does this tie into this idea of Europe and European countries? And is there an occult aspect to this? Because there's probably a lot of cult activity, not only within governments, but within these larger kind of like global like institutions like the European Union. And it does feel, people talk about global governance in terms of like a one world government in a way, if we don't have that already. But kind of European Union feels part of that, and it feels interesting. It all kind of stems from this name, Europa Point. So it's like, again, energetically, is there a link to the wider political structures of Europe and this point? I don't know, but I'm just asking questions. Another aspect to Gibraltar that's quite funny and quite nice is the maquettes, which are sort of these monkeys that live on the top of the rock. And there's a huge legend which kind of links the maquettes to, because not that I know, but I don't think you get maquettes anywhere else in Spain. I could be completely wrong on that, but I haven't seen any monkeys. But yeah, the maquettes, for some strange reason, inhabit the top of this rock. And there's a legend that they came through these underground tunnels that link to Africa. So it's like, they sort of claim that some of these monkeys came from there. And interestingly, they've sort of done DNA tests on some of the maquettes to sort of work out their lineages, and some of them do sort of link to areas of Morocco, other places of Africa. But there'll be more on that later, because, it's quite similar to the Ravens and the Tower of London. There's a whole kind of prophecy around that. But officially, if you kind of look on, mainstream sources, why are the maquettes there? Officially, people think they came over with the Moors as pets, and then obviously they were escaped pets, which then sort of created their own sort of monkey civilization on top of the mountain, on top of the hill, and the limestone kind of monolith. It's quite funny from my point of view. They look a little bit overweight and fat. I think they're pretty well fed because it's such a big kind of tourist destination. You go to the top of this rock, and there are these really narrow roads, which I wouldn't drive up because they get very congested with various tourist cars and stuff. I just walked up the top, some quite beautiful paths as you go up. But obviously, if you're a bit more infirm, and it is quite a sort of steep walk, so people obviously tend to maybe just do a car tour instead. But when you get there, like a lot of these guides are sort of feeding these monkeys. Now, there's quite an interesting relationship where they've trained some of the maquettes to kind of sit on people's head, and the guides will then give them food. And there's a lot of warnings about not sort of feeding the maquettes bad food. So that there is, I think a lot of these guide companies, they sort of leave things like apples and carrots around and stuff. So the maquettes all look pretty well fed. A little bit overweight, if I'm being honest. But I don't have a huge amount of experience with monkeys and maquettes, so I could be wrong. But yeah, they're a little bit bolshy. They're not the sort of things you want to try and kind of stroke, because they're not. They're a little bit grumpy. And then some of the baby ones as well, they're quite erratic because they suddenly jump at you. So kind of walking past them, you got these like really narrow stairs which go up, and you have to kind of walk up, and it's very, very tiring. And sometimes you'll get a monkey that's just randomly asleep on the stairway, and you're sort of trying to creep around it to not disturb it, because they could, they are known to get, violent and sort of lash out on occasion. But there is a whole prophecy around the maquettes, Again, similar to the ravens, the United Kingdom, there's this prophecy from the Tower of London, which overlooks the River Thames, that if the ravens were ever to leave the Tower of London, then Britain would crumble. And then so the ravens that are held within the Tower of London, to prevent that from happening, they clip their wings so they can't sort of fly away. So they're kind of stuck in the Tower of London. But with the macaques, there's a similar sort of prophecy where obviously they're not able to fly away, but there have been times when the macaque numbers have been quite low. And this has actually been taken quite seriously by various kind of British governments, not only just within the government within Gibraltar, but the wider government as well. So this prophecy dictates that if the macaques were ever to leave the Rock of Gibraltar, then Britain would no longer, it would lose its ownership over Gibraltar essentially. And so that's why they've always taken it very, very seriously. When Britain first took over Gibraltar in 1704, it is noted that officially they did document these macaques were there, and whether, it came over the moors or came through these ancient tunnels, I mean, who knows? I don't know. But what is certain that during World War II, they became really, really concerned that the Germans might take Gibraltar because it was obviously very, very strategic. And it's kind of documented that Hitler really wanted to take the speck of land as well. And so the British became quite concerned that when the macaques numbers were very, very low, they actually replenished them. And this is a personal directive from Winston Churchill in 1942. He personally made sure the macaques were replenished, and they were taken from places like Morocco and Algeria. And the prophecy, they became fearful because apparently two of the main pack members died mysteriously. So there was rumours that maybe the Germans in some strange way were able to poison some of these pack members. But similar to the Virgin Mary story in the Spanish army, there's the British army has its own kind of story to do with the macaques being some kind of guardian. And there was a famous battle in 1780 when the Spanish forces were secretly undercover going to invade Gibraltar, and it was the macaques on the rock. They started chattering when the Spanish forces started trying to invade. So it was the noise of the macaques chattering at the Spanish forces as they were encroaching on towards Gibraltar that obviously signaled to the British forces what was happening. And ever since then, it cemented their status as guardians for the British in a way. And this has been quite a sacred thing. And even members of the military who have, tried to injure or even kill the macaques have actually been court-martialed. So the macaques are seen as very, very sacred to the British, but also to the military forces that inhabit Gibraltar itself. It's seen as a guardian, and they are protected weirdly by British forces. But again, this huge limestone monolith, which sort of dominates the entire skyline. And sometimes when I've been for a walk on the Spanish side in some of the national parks around here, even though it's a good hour away, there's been times I've been walking down this path, going back to the car, and just I can see out to sea and wow, there's Gibraltar in the view there on the horizon, and it is quite an imposing sight. Not only physically imposing on the rest of the landscape, but it just has a very energetic aura around it as well. So there's a lot of power physically and energetically. And it is this kind of protruding monolith, and the fact that it is hollow is another fascinating aspect to this. And in terms of macaques, I don't think they sort of tend to inhabit any of the cave systems. They tend to be just on the top itself. But again, there's just lots of stories and layers of history and sort of legends surrounding some of these tunnels and cave systems. And again, it's just like how far and how deep do some of these things go? And there's a lot of mystery kind of surrounding it. And it's why, again, Gibraltar's been so strategic that many times there's so many stories of the British basically embedding themselves in the rock face itself and using it as a natural fortress in a way to kind of maintain their power over Gibraltar. Now, a lot of these many cave systems and tunnels are used as like tourist attractions. And, actually, when I was on the island itself, I went in some of the cave systems there. I think it's called the St. Michael's Cave, and it's beautiful. And they've sort of lit it up with various coloured lights. And so the lights sort of change and things, and there's very dramatic music. But it is a really, really stunning environment to go into. But yeah, getting some more mainstream archaeological information. Apparently the caves are around about 40,000 years old, according to them. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But in terms, we talk about Neanderthals and other kind of primitive societies. There's like remnants of lynxes, hyenas, griffin vultures, which is, been eaten as food, that have been, the remains have been found in these cave systems. And again, I mentioned earlier, like things like large sea snails. I'm not sure if you get large sea snails, but obviously you don't get lynx, you don't get hyenas around the Spanish landscape in the more. You get griffin vultures, and that's another fascinating sort of liminal animal. And I'm talking about the gates to Hades of Gibraltar, and up the road, an hour and a half away where I live now, Los Canas de Mecca, which is seen as like paradise, is heaven. And then you have these griffin vultures that kind of fly in between these two environments. And they are beautiful, beautiful birds. Vultures, they have a strange kind of, I guess, aura around them because they're perceived as being animals that scavenge when people die and things, and they look a bit weird because they've got this like bald head. But actually, when they're flying, they look really, really majestic. And it's this, again, it's like a short video I released sort of recently where I had a lot of synchronicities to do with griffins, and griffin vultures are one of them. And there's a bird that sort of fly between these two environments of the underworld and the spiritual world and the human world. And it's very allegorical the way I'm sort of seeing this bird, because it kind of flies between Gibraltar and it flies between Los Canas de Mecca. It's just very representative of like what this, the griffin is supposed to do, kind of move from the underworld to the human world to the spiritual world. It's really fascinating. But the tunnels overall are well known and officially described as haunted. So a lot of the times when you're reading anything to do with the tunnels, it's kind of one of the official messaging that you read, the fact that they are kind of haunted. It has this strange kind of mythos around it. And there's been lots of instances where people have heard sort of digging in the distance or whistling or singing when there's no one there. And again, I think due to this interesting, powerful energies, there's been stories when people have been driving on these roads or walking along these roads, narrow roads that I talked about, that they have seen sort of spectral activity in terms of ghosts or ghosts of soldiers who are on this eternal kind of watch when they're walking back and forth. This is kind of a repeating story. You get those in Chester as well. You hear about stories about monks kind of walking sort of along the pavement, or obviously Chester has this kind of Roman wall that kind of wraps around, and you see apparently people are seeing the ghostly figures of Roman soldiers on this perpetual kind of watch, kind of night watch. So I think, again, these powerful energies, you're going to get things like this, like ghost stories. And, there's also a lot of information to do with orbs and UFO activity in that area. Not only Gibraltar, but Algeciras is this famous sort of Spanish UFO case that I found in 1980. It's another ongoing narrative in my life to do with UFO events in 1980, which is when I was born. But overall, Strait of Gibraltar is just a lot of strange kind of phenomenon in the sky, whether it's lights or UFOs. And then part of that, again, when you get this mixed activity, you have sort of the military. And obviously, again, Gibraltar is highly militarized. As soon as you kind of walk over, there's a huge airstrip, take off, what you call it, runway, which is used by civil aviation. So you can fly into Gibraltar on this very small airport. But this kind of landing strip just splits off. It's kind of like a border really between, Britain and Spain. And whenever you want to cross over, you can go over in a car, you have to go through a checkpoint, or whether you walk, I just walked, you have to walk over this vast kind of runway. It's really fascinating sort of looking, but you're not supposed to stop. It's actually, you can get into trouble, you can get fined and prosecuted if you do stop. So you're supposed to keep walking. But it's just got buses that are going over, it's got normal pedestrians. And again, a lot of these Spanish, because it's such a distance, they have these electronic scooters, they go, to and from the British and Spanish side. And I think they have had problems in the past, particularly with Brexit, but now you can pretty much walk through sort of immigration or customs without really them. They kind of vaguely glance at your passport, but not too much. But I remember when I flew with my girlfriend that first time, we sort of flew into Gibraltar, and it's quite a hairy experience because, it's kind of a short, even though when you're on the runway, it feels really big, but for a big jet, it's not a lot of space. So when it takes off, you kind of realize you're like along this runway, you're like, oh my God, there's the sea, and it's very, very close. So it's quite exhilarating. So as soon as you enter into Gibraltar, you have that threshold of this runway. And I noticed there was a huge kind of residential barracks, I guess, for a lot of the naval or like engineers or like just general army people that work and live and work in Gibraltar itself. And it seemed like majority of the military activity was kind of overlooking the Spanish side, which kind of makes sense. There's a huge kind of naval shipping yard there, and you can sort of see the remnants of big sort of military ships kind of, in dock essentially. So it's a huge presence, is that kind of the military, and obviously that kind of ties into it's important with shipping lanes and kind of commerce and this ancient pillars of Hercules, ancient kind of narrative, this kind of threshold between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. But the military at points, during, when Spain and UK were just constantly trying to, like, Britain maintain its foothold in Gibraltar, and Spain were constantly trying to take it back. The British forces will always embed themselves within the rock itself. And there's another story I'm going to be talking about shortly during World War II, a thing called Operation Tracer, which interestingly involves like Ian Fleming and the whole James Bond thing. There's a lot of interesting ties. It's a fascinating kind of operation, but it sort of ties World War II into the occult, into Ian Fleming and all sorts, and spycraft. Yeah, it's a fascinating story. But yeah, overall, that rock is incredibly strategic. And apparently, the military still has various tunnels which are used and sealed off. So again, there's a huge amount of mystery surrounding like how deep these goes. Why do the military still have these tunnels? Are they just keeping them because they're strategic, or is there something more going on? Again, there's lots of strange questions with this. And, this is a common theme across all of these military facilities where, they can look quite rudimentary from the street level, from, the land when you're stood there. But actually, how far deep do they go? And that's questions I've had with the Chester military barracks when I did some research. And then also, it's the same with, obviously, the American ones are always a big thing for that. And in Rota, there's a huge naval military base in the sort of more northern tip of southern Spain. And there's lots of questions about, they know that there's military facilities underground, but again, it's just really, really unclear how vast and how big these military facilities are and what are they used for. But going back to the Pillars of Hercules and that whole story, again, Gibraltar perceived as being this physical one of the pillars, and the second one being on the Moroccan side. And it's going back to kind of the old gods of the Greeks, and they perceived that the Atlantic Ocean was not for mortal men. This is the area for the gods. This is quite interesting because how that maybe ties into Atlantis being perceived as being this very advanced civilization, maybe spiritually, maybe technological. And maybe they did something to blow up their own civilization, or there was some kind of reset because it was getting too dark. I don't know. It feels like we're kind of recreating that pattern in a way. We're making quite a dark civilization for ourselves through technology. But yeah, maybe that is why the ancients perceived this place as being, place of the gods, because maybe these people had, technology or understanding of the world that they'd never seen before. And because of that, they just perceived them as being godlike. But also that narrative kind of fits with the different states, because you get the Mediterranean Sea, which is generally quite placid. It's not that tidal. Obviously, tides have an element, but they're not that tidal. And obviously, the weather tends to be good. So it's very rare that you get big storms. Obviously, the Atlantic Ocean is very, very different. Huge swell, massive waves, huge storms. It's a very, very dangerous crossing for all type. Even modern ships now, it's dangerous. It's not a safe place to be. So again, when you're talking about the different environments of the Mediterranean Sea, as a mariner, as a seafarer, when you're in the Mediterranean Sea, you probably feel a lot safer than when you're in the Atlantic Ocean. So that's another reason why they could perceive this area being of the gods, because it's just so chaotic and so beyond comprehension to kind of the normal man's minds about how you would sort of traverse this sea state that's just so chaotic and forever changing. So you have this legend that Hercules split Africa from Europe with his bare hands. And so he made the more sheltered Mediterranean Sea. And again, it's less tidal, it's hotter compared to the vast, exposed, violent, erratic ocean of the Atlantic Ocean. So again, this narrative is another convergence, another threshold. And even Hercules himself, you could see him as a threshold. He was the son, the god of Zeus, a god, and who had a relationship with a mortal princess, Akamene, I think it is, Princess Akamene. I could be butchering that name. So yeah, it kind of, Hercules is the result of the gods basically breeding with a normal mortal princess. So again, it's like another threshold. You could look at this story or narrative in different ways. I guess it could be purely just a legend, just a story, just a narrative, just to explain energy. Or maybe there could be kernels of truth in this, linking back to Atlantis or some form of ancient advanced civilization to other people around the world. If they were from Atlantis, due to their spiritual power or technological power, they could be perceived as being a god, and maybe they just hooked up with a princess from a lesser civilization. So that could be a factor. Or maybe there's a non-human element to this. Maybe this god Zeus was, if you're believing the kind of extraterrestrial kind of narrative from a different planet, maybe that ties into it. Or, could be closer to Earth, could be an inner Earth being, who knows? So yeah, it's just interesting how some of these old gods, these old legends, are there kernels of truth in that? Is there a kind of a more real story behind it than we realize? But yeah, fascinating how this Hercules is a threshold, a boundary in his own right, a portal. He's kind of the link to the human, to the god. And obviously he's created this landmass, he's created the divide between Africa and Europe. And it's a portal from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean. So yeah, it's kind of, if you distill it down even simpler, it could be chaos and order, or the known and the unknown being the Atlantic Ocean, the known being the Mediterranean Sea. So again, there's just all these fascinating narratives, weaving in between each other. But similar to the goddesses, where it feels like sometimes you can have a particular goddess which is known under a different name, determined by the actual civilization that's revering it. It could be the same for Hercules. So at some point, the ancient Greeks had Hercules, and maybe this figure stretches right back into other traditions, such as Phoenicians. And apparently there's a lot of similarities with the Phoenician god called Melqart. I could be pronouncing that incorrectly, but I think that's how you say it. But yeah, I was just watching actually a video where there was some link to Moloch. So again, maybe that's another sort of linkages. And obviously with the modern world now, and people understanding potentially the occult and maybe the elites, and Moloch is perceived as this god of human child sacrifice. So yeah, I'm not sure whether there's connections to that or not. But yeah, definitely it wouldn't surprise me if Hercules was known under a different name. So the Phoenicians had Melqart as a god, and he was like the king of the city. And if you go further north in Spain, in Cadiz, or Cadiz, as the Spanish say, again, it's a really, really ancient place. And some actually think that the Pillars of Hercules relate to this particular area in Cadiz and not at Gibraltar. And they perceive like the king of the city, Melqart, Cadiz. There's a temple of a Melqart just near Cadiz or outside of Cadiz, I'm not quite sure. But there were actual real physical pillars within this temple, and that's what the name, the Pillars of Hercules, actually relate to. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's just another aspect of research I found, that it's not actually the physical landscape, but it's actually within this temple near Cadiz. But overall, Melqart, quite similar to Hercules, was perceived as a death and resurrection god. Which, again, if we bring into more modern traditions like Christianity, you could perceive him as a Christ-like figure, because that's a huge proponent of the Christ journey, is the death and the resurrection. And also God Zeus and this mortal woman is very, very similar. If you think about the idea that a monotheistic God of Christianity and the Virgin Mary through Immaculate Conception. So again, there's a lot of strange similarities between some of these characters, whether it's Hercules or Melqart being death, the resurrection, and also the pregnancy of a child, a male child through Immaculate Conception, so not through normal intercourse with a human, but actually through this godlike figure. But obviously in terms of Christianity, the idea of like a Jesus-like character who sort of bring in a morality structure to society in a certain way is a more of a positive story. But obviously some of these characters like Melqart and Baal and Moloch, again, there are questions on Gibraltar about whether there are signs of child sacrifice under his name in some way, whether it be in Gibraltar or in Cadiz in Spain. Some of these unfortunate rituals involving the death of people, humans, and even worse, children, for a particular god for energetic offerings. So obviously, profoundly, some of these, if that is true, that's obviously pretty horrific if those things were carried out. But again, it's Gibraltar. It just seemed to be this boundary where gods meet the mortals, particularly within the stories of Hercules. It's just another thread, another boundary, another portal between these two worlds. So a lot of these are mythical stories, so it's really, really hard to, from a mainstream point of view, verify that. I think actually we're moving into an area of like intuition, where like some of these answers are going to come to us, it's going to have resonance in our body, and it's going to have truth we can just feel that truth. So I think that is a new phase of humanity that's going to come, and it's kind of happening now and it's unfolding now. But from a mainstream perspective, obviously, there isn't any real evidence to support, apart from a lot of teachings from Plato, where he talks about the pillars of Hercules and the link to Atlantis. But there is, if you're looking from a mainstream academic research point of view, there is documented through some of their testings of huge floods around 5.33 million years ago, and also 11,000 years ago. It's documented that there were huge floods in this region. So again, do some of these floods linked to loss of ancient civilizations along the Atlantic Ocean, or close to Gibraltar, or close to the southwest tip of Spain? I don't know, but there is definitely, within the geography of the land, some of these academic researchers do claim that there are documented huge floods that happened around these periods of time. And obviously, the Atlantic Ocean is a vast, vast place. It's obviously, two big oceans in our world, if they're true, if the globe model is true. Yeah, so the Atlantic Ocean is one. Obviously, the Pacific Ocean is another one. But from Plato, from what he spoke about, was the fact that the lost civilization of Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia combined. So, yeah, from that point of view, if you look at a map, it does seem a vast area. If that did exist and it wasn't the Atlantic Ocean, obviously it would cover quite a huge area of the Atlantic Ocean. So all of that is incredibly fascinating. And, there are groups that maybe still do hold some understanding about some of these myths and legends, whether some of the information is true or not. And they would be the Freemasons. Obviously, we're delving now into secret societies, and there's probably so many different secret societies around the world of different names and different origin stories. But the Freemasons is probably the most visible one, because they tend to have actual physical locations. You can go to the Grand Lodge in London, central London, which I've been to once before. And obviously, most major towns and cities have some kind of Freemasonic element to it. And, a lot of my research when I was in Chester, checking out this airfen line, there's obviously a Freemasonic aspect to this, in terms of the Duke of Westminster was a known Freemason. And then you find out that actually Freemason, maybe 100, 200 years ago, is a lot more widespread than it is now. So even if you're in the military, apparently, if you're a military officer, you would have been a Freemason. A lot of these kind of old world characters like Rudyard Kipling, or just so many like writers or journalists or major politicians or royalty, were all involved in Freemasonry. Now, whether more hidden in Freemason, they don't admit that they're Freemasons, I don't know. Maybe it is more prevalent. But it was just part of society back then. And so, yeah, Gibraltar, being Gibraltar and having a very dominant military presence, was a real stronghold of Freemasonry. In Spain, they had very much of a different approach to Freemasons, and the fact they were persecuted. And in fact, they were so persecuted that rather than having, buildings like lodges actually within the normal urban environment, they did a lot of their sort of rituals and meetups in underground tunnels, hidden away from prying eyes, just so they didn't know that people knew that they were Freemasons, because it was dangerous to their life, literally to their life. And this plays out in Cadiz, again, really, really ancient town, stretches back to the Phoenicians. If you go there, it's just really, really old. You can just sort of see the layers of different architecture. It's really, really tightly packed with buildings and architecture, old mosques and old churches. Fascinating place. But it has a really large network of underground tunnels, and some of them are still being uncovered now. But there's quite a famous Masonic tunnel underneath Cadiz, which has various Masonic symbolisms on the wall, and it's well known it was used for meeting and having rituals hidden away from people, because they were so persecuted within Spain itself. So interestingly, again, a counterpoint to how Spain were treating the Freemasons, Gibraltar became a real haven for the Freemasons. And actually, Gibraltar was the place for one of the oldest English lodges in the world. And in fact, it was seen as a primary lodge, not just for the United Kingdom, but for the whole of Western Europe, because obviously if Spain is persecuting you, obviously Gibraltar is the nearest point, a safe haven for Freemasons across Western Europe. So yeah, Gibraltar and Freemasons been incredibly important. So again, yeah, there's a strategic aspect to this, that it's the bordering town to Morocco and Africa, Mediterranean Sea and Europe. But that is true as well. But again, is the secret societies, Freemasonry, have this huge presence on Gibraltar again because it has an energetic or occult importance to them, being able to maintain their power structures in some way across the globe. Is Gibraltar helping them within that? This leads us on quite nicely to another character, never explicitly linked to Freemasonry, but there's a lot of potential evidence it does. This is Ian Fleming, well known obviously as the writer and creator of James Bond and the books, which became a cultural phenomenon, particularly with the films. Obviously, it's always a background in my childhood. My favourite Bond was always Roger Moore more than I can't even know. Forgotten his name. That's how less important. Sean Connery, of course. Sean Connery, the great Sean Connery. But yeah, Ian Fleming is the writer of the famous James Bond books, and he has a really, really interesting link to Gibraltar and its story, particularly during World War II. Bearing in mind that Ian Fleming wrote the James Bond books from his experiences in real life, which is quite crazy to say because obviously you watch some of the earlier James Bond, in fact, all of the James Bond films, it feels quite fantastical to say that because a lot of them involve narratives with very, very wealthy individuals, usually with a scar on their face and a cat sat in some kind of lair, which kind of ties in quite nicely with Gibraltar and the Rock of Gibraltar and all the tunnels and things. But yeah, I mean, particularly now when you seem to have all these big oligarchs, like billionaires around the world with huge amounts of wealth and power, power over government, and they seem to be, although not explicitly saying it, it just feel like they have little regard for any of us, and obviously they're just trying to accrue more and more power, more and more wealth, and it seems like they have some very strange kind of religious or spiritual views kind of underpinning what they're doing. Although now, I don't know whether that's ever been different, but it just feels like, the British establishment, whether that's MI5, MI6, which kind of links to banking, have never really, I mean, the whole James Bond narrative, the British government always trying to stop these mad people from doing their dastardly plans. But it actually feels like governments and some of these security services are kind of part of that narrative in some unfortunate way. But anyway, yeah, in terms of Ian Fleming and World War II, this kind of stretches back to 1941. So obviously painting the picture everyone knows, Britain is at war with Germany. And then you have an individual called Rear Admiral John Henry Godfrey. He's the director of naval intelligence. And he devised an interesting plan just because Gibraltar was such a strategic place and they were so concerned that Germany was going to invade Gibraltar, or the fact that Spain was going to be heavily influenced by Germany, which actually, from my research, when I went to Playa de los Alemanes, a beautiful beach, southwest tip of Spain again, has a lot of German influence, a lot of German Nazi influence, a lot of Nazi money went into that area. So you had a lot of fleeing Nazis actually building houses and resorts there. And so, yeah, without a doubt, there was a heavy German influence in Spain during World War II that kind of lasted to the 70s and 80s, really, which is really fascinating. Anyway, so they were British at the time were really worried that Spain was going to become heavily influenced or either taken over by the Nazis. So to stop this or to mitigate against this from happening, or if it did happen, they came up with this plan. And it involved having 6 volunteers. And I literally cannot understand how anyone would want to volunteer for this because it's a pretty horrific thing to do. But these 6 volunteers would be sealed in one of the tunnels in the Rock of Gibraltar. And their remit would be to look through these 2 small slits in the rock face, which overlook the Strait of Gibraltar. And from these 2 slits, when they're hidden in this rock, they could then be able to view, ship movements and radio back basically intelligence about what the Germans are doing. So you had these 6 volunteers. They were essentially entombed indefinitely in this rock face, in this tunnel, specifically to gather intelligence and then send it to the British government. Now, I cannot imagine, like me now, like ever volunteering for such a thing. I have little reverence for my own government and the idea of power structures. And yeah, I just can't get my head around how people would sacrifice themselves. And it just goes to show how kind of blinkered and blinded people were by their own governments and their own power structures back then, that they would do something like this. I mean, I can understand it because the narratives were so pervasive, and the general narratives that the Germans were bad and they were wanting to invade Britain and take over, which did, was the kind of the case to a degree, but actually, how much of this was orchestrated energetically by secret elites wanting to reduce the population, and B, make a lot of money, and basically just kind of break up Europe and just change and control it in some strange way through warfare. So obviously we have that kind of hindsight now that there's all kind of money behind this, and the way that World War II, in fact, any war carries out is not, the usual narrative that we're told. It's always something completely different. So yeah, maybe if I was back in that era, I would have been overtaken by the narrative of World War II and would have thought, the Germans were ultimately really, really evil, and it was a fight against good and evil. But at the time, as this operation was being built and designed and carried out, ready to be implemented at any point, everyone knew there was a possibility none of them would be rescued. So it could be a complete, death mission in a really horrific way. And yeah, throughout the entire process of them building and constructing this project, they had builders working on this thing, and they were taken there at night time to work. So it was under cover of night. And even the people working on this project, it was the utmost secrecy. They had no idea where they were at all. I think they had a general idea, maybe they're in Gibraltar, but they didn't know exactly where. And after the project was finished, these builders and everyone that were involved in this particular project, they were all shipped back to the UK, and they were forbidden from leaving Britain until, the end of the war, essentially. So these builders constructed, hollowed out a larger room within the rock face itself with these two slits, which could be used to gather intelligence from German ship movements and other information. And the volunteers would essentially been entombed in this rock, and they were given 6 years of food and water. Now, if any of them actually had died during this process, during the years that they were there, they would have to be embalmed and essentially cemented into the wall or to the floor, obviously to prevent contamination. So how was Ian Fleming involved in this particular story? Well, it turns out that Rear Admiral John Henry Godfrey, who was the director who oversaw this whole operation, whether it was his original idea, I don't know, but he definitely was the main commanding officer who orchestrated the whole thing. But he was assisted by a Lieutenant Commander, Ian Fleming, who was actually the personal assistant of this Admiral Godfrey. And he actually helped design some of the aspects of this operation as well, including what is called the leather chained bicycle, which was used to power one of the radios, which would they then be able to communicate with the wider British military. The idea of a leather chained bicycle to power a radio, a CB radio, is quite ingenious, obviously, because sound insulation is the utmost importance, because you don't want to give your position away to the Germans. So I think they thought about sound insulation quite heavily, so hence why they use a leather chain bike to prevent noise. But the overall operation, again, was called Operation Tracer. And it was a hidden room hollowed out within the rock face itself. And it was only 44 feet in length and 16 feet wide and 8 feet high. So yeah, pretty intense for those 6 people that are kind of in this space. And imagine that being there for 6 years. It'd be quite horrific. I mean, they had, food and water for 6 years. But another sound insulation mechanism they had a cork floor, again, to prevent any sort of sound escaping out of this entombment. But overall, I think it was divided into separate areas. There was like a radio room for communication, a medical station. So if any of them became gravely ill or died, there'd be an area where they could be tended to. And obviously, again, a general living area where they could then view through these 2 slits through the rock face to be able to see these ship movements out of the Strait of Gibraltar itself. But Ian Fleming's naval intelligence operations didn't just end with Operation Tracer. Fascinatingly, he was involved in a thing called Operation GoldenEye, which I've never read the James Bond books, but obviously there's the Pierce Brosnan film, GoldenEye, which became quite a cultural phenomenon. Weirdly, the computer game GoldenEye was like a massive success. I would say it was even bigger than the film. I think it was an N64. My brother had this console, and GoldenEye was an amazing game at the time. And I think it's quite a cultural phenomenon for a lot of people my age. But yeah, so Ian Fleming was involved in Operation GoldenEye, which I never knew was a real operation. And essentially what this operation involved was setting up a spy network from Morocco. So again, if Germany ever took Spain or Gibraltar, this would then be initiated. I mean, if you look at some of the original James Bond, the books and the films, there's a real aesthetic with it, and it lends quite well to the idea of Morocco and Tangiers, and you have like, people from all over the world in this very exotic location of Morocco. It has that old colonial aesthetic that you see some of these films of the original James Bond films, where it's weird how Morocco in real life apparently became a haven for spies, and it's very much how you have the backdrop of idea of luxury casinos, people wearing fez hats and dinner jackets, and stunningly beautiful women adorned with jewels and gold. It's funny because most people perceive James Bond as being fantasy, but again, Ian Fleming took real inspiration from his real life experiences in this kind of spy world. And it's fascinating how Morocco plays a huge part in the spy world back then. I don't know if it still does now, but it was really perceived as being this real spy playground, a place where they could relax. So a lot of the spy world, spycraft, or people involved, they would go to Morocco, and it was seen as a place to relax where they wouldn't be in danger. It's kind of I made the analogy in my own head, you see the film The Highlander, when the Highlanders can't be harmed on sacred ground. So if they're in a church or cathedral, they can't fight. So it's kind of like the same thing in Morocco. If you're there, you're basically, in a holiday, so you're not going to get touched by other spies or try to be poisoned or killed in some horrific way. So it's just funny how Tangiers or Morocco was just perceived as some kind of holiday resort for the spycraft world. And again, coming back to Ian Fleming and this idea of Freemason, there's no sort of definitive links that apparently can be found documenting that he was a Freemason, but his father definitely was. And again, going back to my idea that, if you were high up in the military as an officer, it's pretty much certain that you were a Freemason. Most kind of wealthy people were. But there are a lot of researchers that claim his books are filled with occult symbology, references, Masonic codes. This is according to some researchers' information. Whether that was conscious or unconscious, because sometimes, whether writers who become quite successful are inadvertently channeling ideas into their work and they don't know. I think that happens quite a lot, not just in writings, but in films. So if you're writing film scripts, but also kind of musicians as well, there's this strange, where are these ideas really coming from? But there's a lot of information out there where, Ian Fleming had a lot of dealings with Aleister Crowley. Obviously, Aleister Crowley is kind of this big, verbose figure of occult knowledge from history, and it just feels so many roads kind of lead to him and what he was up to, and doesn't seem like a very nice man in terms of some of the activities he was involved in. But he seems to be revered by various very, very successful musicians and particular elites, whether it's political power or monarchies, seem to have a reverence for Crowley himself. And so, yeah, Ian Fleming does have links to Crowley. But obviously, if you look at some of these evil characters within James Bond, whether it's like Blofeld, or you pick any of the kind of evil characters, these evil kind of men who are trying to take over the world, they do have a lot of visual kind of references to Aleister Crowley. You sort of see some of the photos of Aleister Crowley. He's quite a butch man with a bald head. And Blofeld has a very, very similar aesthetic to him. And so there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, Crowley was an inspiration for some of these characters. And this kind of links into the whole idea of MI6 and MI5 and these other security agencies around the world, whether it's the CIA or Mossad, and how much is actually, linked to really banking and occult power. And there's a lot of information, the idea of John Dee, who's the astrology for Elizabeth I and stuff, and he was perceived as being the first 007. He was seen as the eyes of the Queen, so he was seen as the godfather's kind of spycraft. And a lot of his work involved in, occult rituals and scrying mirrors, trying to channel information and talking to entities. And again, there's some evidence to suggest that maybe, Britain being a very, very small island, how were they able to take over most of the world? And some potentially say that, maybe this comes from occult power, which, maybe stems from John Dee being the very first 007. 007 obviously is James Bond, so there's that kind of link as well. So the occult world does seem very, very highly linked to James Bond, spycraft, and specifically Ian Fleming himself. So again, talking about, civilization of Britain being very masculine, Gibraltar being very masculine. These are very masculine things, Operation Tracer, Ian Fleming, Godfrey, James Bond. Again, very, very alchemical, masculine archetypes. And what's fascinating within the James Bond stories, James Bond always kind of links up with a feminine presence, one that sticks in my head is kind of Octopussy, Roger Moore, and there's various kind of feminine, femme fatales, dark feminine, who end up being quite helpful, even though they appear to be sort of maybe on the bad side, trying to do bad things, but actually kind of, the very last moment sort of are helping James Bond in a way. And it's in a way, it's like a strange alchemical mixing of masculine and feminine energies. Weaving in some of my own personal stories, I've seen some on this strange alchemical journey, and I've been looking deeply at some of the names of these women that I've been involved in and some of the experiences that I've had that I've spoken about on this podcast. But there just seemed to be something very, very interesting kind of going on. Whether you describe this as like twin flame or like through the work of Eve Lorgan, she talks about the thing called the alien love bite. But I've been sort of researching some of the names, and one of the girls was called like Olivia. And actually within Spain, the word Olivia really, again, relates back to the Virgin Mary. I've seen a lot of houses, they're called the Virgin of Olivia, which roughly translates as Virgin of the Olive. And the olive is very, very important, obviously, across the Mediterranean like cultures. But, the olive is very representative, interestingly, as the Virgin Mary as well. And obviously you get like virgin olive oil. So olives, olive trees are all around this area. In fact, the whole of Spain and many of the Mediterranean countries, olives are really, really important because they give you food, but also they give you oil for cooking, but also that oil can be used for light. So they kind of create light as well. So it's like a light-bearing substance. So incredibly useful food, tree, and just very, very symbolic of feminine energy. But again, if you're stretching this story, this archetype to the Virgin Mother, the Virgin Mary, is it known under different names? Again, so we're talking, again, relating back to Chester, my own hometown, with like Minerva statue that's there, the River Dee being a Dee goddess, Diva, Airfen was particularly, again, the Celtic name for a goddess. These are the names, essentially the same energy, this feminine energy. And bringing it forward to now, when you have a lot of information to do with extraterrestrials, and I always find that Chris Bledsoe's story quite interesting. Released a few videos on him, and he talks about having encounters with something called the White Lady, who claims that, she's also linked to Hathor or Athena. And this individual, a Christian contactee, so he has a real belief in God. And all of these kind of experiences he kind of relates it back to his Christianity. But yeah, it's just, he had a big, he prophesied that something really big would happen in April, which it hasn't happened. It was like a new knowledge was going to come into the human sphere, and it was going to involve Egypt and the Sphinx, and there was going to be something under the paw, which hasn't happened. Maybe something energetic kind of shifted. There definitely has been a huge amount of shifts this year, so maybe it is linking to that. And there's this thing called the Star of Regulus, and it's going to align with the Sphinx, but nothing seems to have happened. I haven't really noticed anything apart from the energies kind of shifted. But again, there's just so many stories of people having feminine presences. And then within Portugal, there's this Fatima thing where apparently this apparition, Fatima, appeared to these shepherd children and stuff and gave all these prophecies and ancient knowledge. And weirdly, kind of the Vatican seemed to sequester all of this knowledge, and they're releasing it at different times. So it's kind of going through the filter of the Vatican. So how much of that information is true or not, I don't know. But there does seem to be a recurring theme of this like feminine presence like appearing to people, whether it's like, you look in biblical terms, you have like Archangel Gabriel appearing to people, or the White Lady in Chris Bledsoe, or Fatima to these children in Portugal. And I'm sure there are many others across the world. Whether these are genuine entities, genuine energies, I don't know, like guides, guardians in some way, potentially guiding humanity in a certain direction or releasing information to help people on their spiritual journey, or whether it's just an out and out trickster force. I don't know. But again, using my own model of my own consciousness, my own body, these things are going to be linked to you, whether that's a good aspect to your energy or maybe a shadow aspect to your energy. And bringing it again back to Gibraltar and the idea of pillars of Hercules, obviously that's a very masculine archetype, Hercules and Melqart and Jesus Christ, whether these characters are all kind of the same entity or energy, and the pillars of Hercules kind of represent that. But actually, some people see these as functioning, the pillars of Hercules as functioning Marian shrine. So Virgin Mary, Marian shrine, where you have Our Lady of Europe on one pillar and Our Lady of Africa on the other pillar. So again, a complete flip. So it not being masculine, being more of a feminine presence. So yeah, and just another bit of information to add into the mix. But talking about apparitions or across the southwest of Spain, again, there are many, many olive trees everywhere. And there are many stories of apparitions linking to Mary and the connection to olive trees, which is fascinating. And going back to the Phoenicians, it's actually claimed that the Phoenicians introduced olives and olive trees to these environments in the Mediterranean. But olive trees are so important to so many cultures across the Mediterranean, whether that be Italy, Spain, Greece. I mean, Croatia, there's so many where olives and olive oil is the foundation to like their cuisine. And yeah, it's just fascinating. I never thought you could also use the oil to burn light. So it has a very allegorical kind of, creating light in the darkness as well. But there's a very intrinsic link to, these olive trees, specific sacred olive trees, and also apparitions of the Virgin Mary. And, just kind of theorizing, is there a link to this and feminine sacred waters as well? Because a lot of these very dusty kind of desert-like environments like here now, they have a lot of powerful spiritual water underneath. And when that's kind of combined with some of these olive trees, is that kind of part of the mechanism that helps some of these apparitions? And it's well known, sacred waters, spring waters, holy wells across the world, people have reported miraculous healings, powerful spiritual experiences. And the same thing has been reported with olive trees, certain sacred olive trees that are linked to the Mother Mary. People have reported, drinking the oil of these particular trees or eating olives have had the same effect, the same miraculous healing. And I was very much influenced by Maria Wheatley, the sort of master dowser. I've sort of seen her talk multiple times and she kind of taught me dowsing, but she, along with other dowsers, sort of speak about feminine and masculine water being the yang water coming from the sky, rainwater, and actually the yin water, which is underground spring water, which has a lot more oxygen in it and obviously has a lot of stories linked to apparitions and spectacular healings. Underground spring water being feminine and just being incredibly healing. So maybe that interaction with feminine waters and the olive trees just creates like a really powerful energy. Bringing it again back to this general theme of this podcast about the idea of convergence, thresholds, portals. The olive tree just spans again all of these various cuisines, whether it's Spanish, Greek, or Italian, and others. It's a portal for that. But also spiritually, I mean, the olive tree is revered in so many different spiritual traditions, whether it's Celtic, the Romans, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. They all have a reverence for the olive tree. And actually, really, really weirdly, when I was researching some of this information about kind of olive trees and its links to the Virgin Mary and Mother Mary and some of these other goddesses, like in the background, there's a rather weird niche musician, US musician called Oliver Tree, and he died recently under really mysterious circumstances. And there was a helicopter mechanical problem and he sort of jumped from a helicopter or something. But it's really, really strange because apparently, apart from his name, Oliver Tree, Olive Tree, and he just died when I was kind of doing this research, which is bizarre. But a lot of his music videos involve him dying, some of them falling from a helicopter crash, apparently. And then I've seen loads of videos online when he was having problems with his label, Atlantic Records, which is strange when you talk about the Atlantic Ocean. And he was kind of calling them out, saying that they weren't treating him right anymore. They wanted to leave, and they were basically just mothballing his album that he spent sort of months doing. He traveled around the world sort of recording his album. They weren't going to release it. So he's looking to change record labels. But actually, there's lots of videos of him talking about various conspiracies, about some of the connections with elites that he has, and, basically talk about some of the information he's kind of found out. And he did a lot of trips to Antarctica and he was trying to look for alien bases and hidden tunnels and things. So he was quite a free thinker. And so I can't help but think he was maybe sort of taken out because I think, the music industry is a bit of a mafiosa kind of industry. And if you're no longer useful or either dangerous, they will basically kill you. But it's just so weird that I was doing this research to do with olive trees and the Virgin Mary. Then he sort of died and his kind of name popped up. And I was like, oh yeah, Oliver Tree, how bizarre. So yes, that's a bit of weirdness to end on. So in summary, tying a bow on this, in conclusion, I can't think of anywhere else in the world that I've come across. Yeah, maybe I haven't thought so deeply about some of the places I've been to, but just with Gibraltar, it's just fascinating. And it's just interesting how I never ever thought I'd ever go back there ever again. Because the first time I went there, I was just like, nah, this place is just not interesting in any way, shape, or form. And just I've been proven so wrong, like going back and actually having a really nice time, really enjoying sort of bumbling around, exploring and researching. And again, just the weather when I was there was just absolutely spectacular. I just remember the light, even looking at some of the footage, it's just so crystalline and just so beautiful. The light that's coming out from the sky that day, it was just amazing. But I just can't think of anywhere in the world with so many layers of narrative and story. It's just really, really bizarre. And I don't think a lot of researchers or people really kind of think about Gibraltar. Obviously, it's an anomaly because you have like mainland Spain. It must be a constant irritation to the Spanish to have Britain just, holding on to this tiny speck of land that overlooks the Strait of Gibraltar. It must infuriate them. But I just think a lot of this is all energetic. It feels like, some of these shadow systems are kind of feeding it off this energy in some way. And when you have an enormous amount of light, you have the shadow there. And this is when you have this like huge convergence of so many things, like, the earth energies and the culture and the countries. It's all kind of opposing forces. And it just creates this interesting sort of dynamic. But I was just kind of blown away when I was sort of reading about, Gibraltar being the gates to the Hades, to the underworld or hell. And again, just an hour and a half up the coast in Las Canas de Mecca, where I live now, which is perceived as paradise or heaven, in the Moorish kind of traditions. Just bizarre. And again, I was talking about these griffin birds that are kind of flying between. I just thought, oh my God, all of these things are having real meaning for me. I think there's probably a lot of people who wouldn't give it a second thought, but I'm just like, just really seeing the symbols. I'm just really seeing all the synchronicities all the time like that. And every time I dig deeper, there's more and more and more. It's just wild. But it's like, again, that grand convergence of the known world and the unknown. And there's all the sort of unknown myths and legends, which a lot of people know about. And, how far back do these stories go? How far back are they known under different names? And then how many kernels of truth are in some of these stories, particularly like the Pillars of Hercules and the idea of like, the gods marrying up with mortal women. I mean, is there something to that? But again, you have some of these real world physical events potentially and myths. But then you have the current, paranormal events around that, wrapped around that, whether that's spectral ghosts appearing on the hill or UFOs or your orbs in the sky. So yeah, again, it's just a place of convergence of so many different things. But again, for me, it all kind of comes back to that polarity of male and female. And it just seems to be in everything. Everywhere I look, it's kind of there. That narrative is there. Even, looking at some of these conflicts, again, talking about the Battle of Trafalgar. So there you go. That's Gibraltar. I recommend it. I mean, I think I wouldn't want to give the impression like it's really, really ancient looking. Like maybe, up the road on the Spanish side, if you go to Tarifa, which is quite a big location for water sports like kite surfing and windsurfing because of the constant wind there. And there's a really beautiful, like medieval kind of old town, which is stunning, which is a great sort of tourist place to go. And Gibraltar's not really like that. And the Spanish side is not like that at all. There are some grimy elements of the Spanish side without a doubt. And I think maybe that the first time I went, maybe I couldn't really look past that. But overall, like the energy and just the sort of natural environment of the Strait of Gibraltar, it's just stunning. And obviously the weather tends to be always good and hot and sunny. So that's always a plus point. But yeah, again, looking at this whole area with new awakened, more spiritual eyes, there's just so much going on in such a small space. But thanks for joining me. Sorry, there might have been a few noises with birds in the background, and where I'm living at the moment, they've got chickens and cockerels and stuff. So that might have bled into the audio. But yeah, that gives it texture and character. But yeah, just to remind you, you can catch me on YouTube or Rumble or BitChute. I have a Substack as well, or is the reconsidersimon.com. And I've literally just made a Etsy store as well. So I'm going to start creating some t-shirt designs with some of my illustrations. So yeah, I'm just gradually kind of building some of the products on there. So please do check that out. I think it's etsy.com/shop/reconsidersimon, or you can go to my website and there's a banner up there you can kind of click. It's a great way to support me as well. Anyway, I hope you're well wherever you are in the world, and I will see you in the next one. Take care. Bye.